The committee is pleased to welcome back the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to discuss the administration's fiscal year 2019 budget request for the Department of Defense. We're also pleased to have the Comptroller available to answer any questions. We meet under rather different circumstances than last year. Congress and the administration have worked together to provide to the military the resources they need to begin to reverse the erosion of our military strength. There is agreement on the funding levels for defense for fiscal year 19. We know how much we have to work with. The challenge as we work through the details is that some of the consequences of the years of cuts and neglect are becoming more apparent. A study published this weekend by Military Times found that aviation mishaps have risen about 40% since the Budget Control Act took effect. The alarming number of aviation accidents in just the past 3.5 weeks reveals how deep the damage goes and the magnitude of the task of repairing and rebuilding our capabilities. Meanwhile, as events in Syria remind us, the world does not slow down and wait on us to rebuild. This committee has had a number of hearings and briefings this year to examine more closely the challenges we face, from readiness to space and cyber. We've studied what adversaries are doing. We've heard from combatant commanders, service chiefs, and outside experts. The issue today is how well the administration's budget request meets our national security needs under the parameters set in the Bipartisan Budget Act. We also want to examine how this budget request implements the new National Defense Strategy about which the Secretary testified in February. I am committed to working with the Department to achieve reforms that enable our military to be more agile and more efficient in facing the threats which confront us. The challenges are great, but if Congress and the Department work together, we can ensure that the military has what it needs to meet those challenges. I would yield to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, Comptroller Norquist. We appreciate you being here, and we appreciate your leadership in the Pentagon. And the Chairman, I think, is quite correct in that it's better this year that we have a budget. For 2018, we have the framework of an agreement for 2019 going forward, and certainly some degree of predictability is going to be enormously helpful. And without question, we have a readiness crisis within the military. And the Chairman has cited a number of the examples of that. We are better now than we were a year or two ago, but still a long way to go to make up for 15 years of war and, frankly, for spending money in other places and not on readiness. So as we look at the 2018-2019 budget, one of my top priorities is to make sure that that money goes to make sure that our force is ready, that we address that problem, because there will be other needs, there will be other pressures. I hope we don't give in to those. I hope we remember that the troops should come first. Having them ready for the fights that we are saying they need to be ready for is our #1 priority going forward. I will also point out that while 2018 and 2019 are great, I hope you're also planning for a lean future, because we are looking at an over $1 trillion deficit this year. We just cut taxes by almost $2 trillion, increased spending by somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion in the face of a now nearly $22 trillion debt. So going forward in the next decade, certainly for the country as a whole, but for your purposes, for the military, understanding our fiscal restraints and dealing with them is going to be a critically important part of making sure that our military is ready to do what it can do. So we do need to get the budget under control. On a couple other matters just quickly, in North Korea, I just want to emphasize that we should find a peaceful solution. It is a very, very difficult situation, but going to war on the Korean Peninsula would have catastrophic consequences. So I hope that we figure out a way to contain and control the very real threat of North Korea, but at the same time prevent going to war. The last two things I'll say is, one, on Syria. It is a very, very difficult situation. You know, two presidents have struggled with how to deal with it. I'm not going to pretend that I have an easy answer, but until we have a more long-term strategy, until we have some idea where we're going in Syria and the Middle East, it seems unwise to me to start launching missiles. We need to know where that's going, what the purpose of it is before we take that act. I think it's also worth pointing out it is hard to find a legal justification for that military strike in Syria absent congressional approval. So whatever you decide to do, I would hope you would include the legislative branch. And then lastly, we have heard a lot, and I agree with this, that we have shifted our focus in the last few years. We are now back into an era of great power struggles because of what Russia and China are doing and how aggressive they are in pushing their agendas and their ideas across the world, and I agree with that. I just hope that we don't see a great power struggle as simply an excuse for another arms race, and that we understand that a great power struggle involves all the elements of our government. Diplomacy, I think most critically allies, finding partners in the world to advance our agenda and thwart those aspects of the Russia and Chinese agenda that are against the interests not just of the United States, but I think of the world. So that we work with partners and we use diplomacy and we use development, that we don't simply use the excuse of the rise of Russia and China to build more and more weapons. There has to be a much more comprehensive approach if we are going to be successful in creating a peaceful and prosperous world, which certainly is in our best interest, but is in the best interest of the entire world as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Secretary and Chairman, welcome. Without objection, any written statements you'd like to make will be made part of our record. And, Mr. Secretary, you're recognized for any comments you'd like to make.
Well, thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. I do appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2019. I'm joined by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, who will discuss military factors, and the Department's Comptroller Chief Financial Officer, Mr. David Norquist, who is superintending the first full financial audit in most of our lifetime, since it's the first in the Department of Defense history. I'm now in my second year as Secretary of Defense, and with your help, we have made steady progress during the past 14 months. In January, the Department published the 2018 National Defense Strategy, to which I testified previously. It's the first in a decade. Framed within the President Trump's national security strategy, our national defense strategy provides clear direction for America's military to restore its competitive edge in an era of re-emerging long-term great power competition. The Department next released the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which calls for America's military to provide a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, one that is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to deter 21st century threats and to reassure our allies. In South Asia and Afghanistan, uncertainty in the region has been replaced by the certainty of President Trump's South Asia strategy. Concurrently, in the Middle East, we have dramatically reduced ISIS' physical caliphate using a coordinated whole-of-government approach that works by, with, and through our allies and partners to crush ISIS' claim of invincibility and deny them a geographic haven from which to plot murder. Last month, thanks to the bipartisan support and political courage of Congress, President Trump signed an omnibus spending bill that funds the government for the remainder of the fiscal year. This law, along with the two-year budget agreement passed as part of February's bipartisan Budget Act, finally freed us from the inefficient and damaging continuing resolution funding process and is now providing the predictable and sufficient funding needed to continue implementing the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Our fiscal year 2019 budget requests the resources necessary to fulfill the Department's enduring mission to provide the combat credible forces needed to deter war and, if deterrence fails, to win in the event of conflict. These forces reinforce America's traditional tools of diplomacy, ensuring that the President and our diplomats negotiate from a position of strength. To restore our nation's competitive military edge, the fiscal year 19 budget funds our national defense strategy's three overarching lines of effort. First, to build a more lethal force. Second, to strengthen traditional alliances while building new partnerships. And third, to reform the Department's business practices for better performance and affordability. Our first line of effort is to build a more lethal force. All our Department's policies, expenditures, and training must contribute to the lethality of our military. We cannot expect success fighting tomorrow's conflicts with yesterday's thinking, yesterday's weapons, or yesterday's equipment. As President Washington said during his first State of the Union address, to be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. And today, ladies and gentlemen, our lethal military arm will enhance our diplomats' persuasiveness. The paradox of war is that an adversary will always move against any perceived weakness, so we cannot adopt a single preclusive form of warfare. We must be able to fight across the entire spectrum of combat. The nation must field sufficient, capable forces to deter conflict, and if deterrence fails, we must win. Following this logic, we must maintain a credible nuclear deterrent so these weapons are never used, and a decisive conventional force that can also wage irregular warfare. Preserving the full range of our nation's deterrent options requires the recapitalization of our Cold War legacy nuclear deterrent forces as initiated during the previous administration. Modernizing the nation's nuclear deterrent delivery systems, including our nuclear command and control, is the Department's top priority, and these programs are fully funded in the fiscal year 2019 budget. The FY 2019 budget also funds enhancements to the U.S. missile defense capabilities to defend the homeland, our deployed forces, allies, and partners against an increasingly complex ballistic missile threat. In accordance with the soon-to-be-released 2018 Missile Defense Review, this budget requests continued robust support for missile defense capability and capacity to keep pace with the advancing threats. The proposed budget will modestly increase end strength for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to restore readiness, adding 25,900 to the active and reserve force. The budget will also continue to invest in the military's most important assets, its warfighters, with a 2.6% military pay increase. The 2009 budget continues increased procurement of preferred and advanced munitions, a necessity due to ongoing operations in the Middle East and the need for war reserves. 10 combat ships and 8 support ships are funded, arresting the downward trajectory of our Navy's size and lethality. We will continue production of 77 F-35 and 24 F-18 aircraft, evaluating the performance of both to determine the most appropriate mix moving forward. This budget request funds systems to enhance communications and resiliency in space, addressing overhead, persistent infrared capabilities, positioning, navigation, and timing, plus space launch systems. Our 2018 National Defense Strategy also prioritizes investing in technological innovation to increase lethality. Cyber, advanced computing, big data analytics, artificial intelligence, autonomy, robotics, miniaturization, additive manufacturing, directed energy, and hypersonics are the very technologies that we need to fight and win wars of the future. Every investment in the strategy-driven FY 2019 budget is designed to contribute to the lethality of our military and ensuring that subsequent Secretaries of Defense inherit a military force that is fit for its time. Those seeking to threaten America's experiment in democracy should know, if you challenge us, it will be your longest and worst day. Our 2018 National Defense Strategy's second line of effort is to strengthen traditional alliances while building new partnerships. In the past, I had the privilege of fighting many times in defense of the United States, but I never fought in a solely American formation. It was always alongside foreign troops. Easier said than done. Winston Churchill noted that the only thing harder than fighting with allies is fighting without them. History proves that we are stronger when we stand united with others, and accordingly, our military will be designed, trained, and ready to fight alongside allies. Working by, with, and through allies and partners who carry their fair share remains a source of strength for the United States. Since the costly victory in World War II, Americans have carried a disproportionate share of the global defense burden while others recovered. Today, the growing economic strength of allies and partners has enabled them to step up, as demonstrated by the 74 nations and international organizations participating in the Defeat ISIS campaign, and again in the 41 nations standing shoulder to shoulder in NATO's Resolute Support mission in Afghanistan. To date, 15 NATO allies are also increasing their defense budget as a share of the gross domestic product, giving credence to the value of democracies standing together. Further, our Pacific partners are strengthening their defenses. Our third line of effort is the urgent reform of the Department's business practices to provide both solvency and security. We will continue to establish a culture of performance where results and accountability matter on every expenditure to gain full benefit from every single taxpayer dollar spent on defense. We are committed to exercising the utmost degree of financial stewardship and budget discipline within the Department. In this regard, this year we will deliver our Department's first full financial audit in history. We will find the problems and take swift action to correct our deficiencies, thereby earning the trust of Congress and the American people. I am confident we have the right leaders in place to make meaningful reform a reality. Pat Shanahan as Deputy Secretary of Defense, Jay Gibson as Chief Management Officer, Ellen Lord as our Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Michael Griffin as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Bob Daigle as Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, and David Norquist as the Department's Comptroller Chief Financial Officer. Each brings the intellect and the energy and the experience required to implement and sustain meaningful reform, ensuring the Department provides performance and affordability for the American taxpayer. The Department is transitioning to a culture of performance and affordability that operates at the speed of relevance. We will prioritize speed of delivery, continuous adaptation, and frequent modular upgrades. With your continued critical support, we will shed outdated management and acquisition processes while adopting American industry's best practices. Our management structure and processes are not engraved in stone. They are a means to an end. If current structures inhibit our pursuit of lethality, I have directed service secretaries and agency heads to consolidate, eliminate, or restructure to achieve their mission. The 2018 National Defense Strategy's three primary lines of effort, building a more lethal force, strengthening our traditional alliances and building new partnerships, and reforming the Department's business practices for performance and affordability, will restore our competitive military advantage, ensuring we are prepared to fight across the full spectrum of combat now and into the future. I want to thank this committee for your strong spirit of bipartisan collaboration. While our trajectory is going in the right direction, our work has just begun. This is a year of opportunity and a chance to continue to work together, building on a strong start as we turn the 2018 National Defense Strategy into action. The points I need to emphasize in today's hearing is that this budget, which is designed to execute the National Defense Strategy, is building a more lethal force by restoring current and future readiness, modernizing our nuclear deterrent forces and their command and control systems, building for the future by improving our military's technological competitive edge, and reforming the Department's business processes to establish a culture of performance and affordability to ensure security and solvency. This strategy is the guidepost for all our actions, including this year's strategy-driven budget request, driving meaningful reform to establish that enduring culture of performance, affordability, and agility. I cannot appear before you without expressing my gratitude to the men and women of the Department of Defense. They are the ones that must ultimately turn the National Defense Strategy into action. Every day, more than 2 million service members and nearly 1 million civilians do their duty, honoring previous generations of veterans and civil servants who have sacrificed for their country. It is my privilege to serve alongside them, and I thank them for their tireless efforts and unyielding standards in defense of our nation. General Dunford is prepared to discuss the military dimensions of our budget request.
General Dunford.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis and Undersecretary Norquist here today. It's an honor to represent your men and women in uniform. And while we all recognize the challenges that the chairman outlined and the ranking member outlined in their opening remarks, I want to begin by assuring you that the U.S. military has a competitive advantage over any potential adversary today. I am confident we can defend the homeland, meet our alliance commitments, and prevail in any conflict. But as I testified last summer, after years of sustained operational commitments, budgetary instability, and advances by our adversaries, our competitive advantage has eroded and our readiness has been degraded. Driven by the national defense strategy that the Secretary outlined and building on the FY17 and 18 appropriations, the fiscal year 19 budget submission supports rebuilding the lethal and ready joint force that the nation needs. Our defense strategy recognizes the central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition by revisionist powers. With Russia and China as the priority, we also have to meet the challenges of North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations. China and Russia continue to invest across the full range of nuclear, cyber, space, and conventional capabilities. Both states are focused on limiting our ability to project power and undermining the credibility of our alliances. They are also increasingly adept at advancing their interests through coercive, competitive activity below the threshold of armed conflict. North Korea has been on a relentless pursuit to develop their nuclear and missile capability. They have been clear that these capabilities are intended to threaten the United States and our allies in the region. Iran continues to spread malign influence and create instability across the Middle East. And while we have made a great deal of progress over the past year, we're still grappling with the challenges of violent extremism, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and associated movements. Defending our homeland, our allies, and advancing our interests in the context of these and many other challenges requires us to maintain a balanced inventory of ready, lethal, and flexible forces that are relevant across the range of military operations. Fortunately, with your support, we have begun to arrest the erosion of our competitive advantage, and we're on the path to developing the force we need to meet our current and future challenges. This year's budget builds on the readiness recovery that we started in 17 and reinforces our effort to develop the capabilities we need both today and tomorrow. In requesting your support for this year's budget submission, I and all the senior leaders in the department are making a commitment to you that will make every dollar count. We'll fully support the auditing initiative led by Secretary Norquist, and we'll maintain an ongoing dialogue with you on our progress toward addressing our current readiness challenges and building the capabilities we'll need tomorrow. To restore our competitive advantage and ensure our men and women never find themselves in a fair fight, the U.S. military requires sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. The funding in this budget is sufficient. I look forward to working with Congress to make it sustained and predictable. Thank you again for your support and the opportunity to appear before you today.
Mr. Norquist, my understanding is you do not have an oral statement. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Secretary, a lot of members want to ask questions. Let me just pose one question for you. I made reference to the study that came out this weekend that showed a 40% increase in aviation mishaps since the Budget Control Act took effect. And yet over the past 3 weeks, there have been some criticism about the amount in the omnibus funding bill, which Congress passed and the President signed. I think it's important for this committee and for the country to hear from you about the significance of the funding bill that was passed and the 2-year agreement that most of us voted for in February to raise the Budget Control Act. How does that affect the men and women who serve our nation and our national security?
Chairman, thank you. I believe that this committee is probably keenly aware of the readiness challenges we have faced. And ever since I got into this job, you have been part of the solution. All of you have been part of the solution. Right now, we cannot repair our way out of the situation we're in. We're actually going to have to buy, in some cases, the capabilities that we have simply worn out and had to set aside It can't even be repaired, whether it be aircraft where squadrons do not have enough, or it be ships that cannot go back to sea on time because when we open them up, long overdue for their maintenance period, we find things wrong inside that lengthen their time in the shipyards. When you put all this together, this is why you can have young officers getting promoted to major, for example, that have not had the same flight hours that you have expected during your tenure on this committee that a lieutenant or captain would have had. They have not had the opportunity because we have not funded for it. The aircraft are not available, the spare parts and the maintainers have not been there. This is not pointing a finger at anyone in particular. It's where we're at, and we deal with it. I'll let the historians deal with how did we get here. But with your help, we are now going to be able to come out from underneath this and put our readiness back where you expect it to be when you put out billions of taxpayer dollars for various parts of the military, yet when we put it all together, due to the continuing resolutions, it did not have the kind of budget support it needed for a balanced force. The bottom line is we can spend every dollar. The audit is going to find problems, Chairman, and we will correct those problems. But we will be working with you, and we are keenly aware that we have got to deliver a more ready force, objectively, quantitatively, a more ready force that we can lay out to you. It is absolutely necessary what you've given us, and now it's up to us to spend every dollar where you expect it to be spent.
General Dunford, do you want to add anything to the effects of this budget agreement?
The only I would say, Chairman Thornberry, it is an agreement that allows us to balance both the needs of today and tomorrow. And to emphasize the Secretary's point, I think we used to look at operations and maintenance money as associated with readiness and then modernization money as associated with the future. And to the Secretary's point, I really do believe today there's a distinction without a difference when you talk about readiness and modernization. We actually have to modernize the force in order for us to be ready against the challenges that are outlined in the National Defense Strategy. And I think as a result of the 15 years of erosion, I don't think we can collectively think about these as discrete tasks. In other words, today is tomorrow, and the investments that we make in maintaining a competitive advantage in the context of the National Defense Strategy are the same ones we need to make sure our squadrons, our battalions, our brigades are up and running today.
Thank you. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on the budget, just out of curiosity, I wanted your response is for FY19, the agreement that we reached that the Chairman just alluded to, I believe, had us, if you count the DOE portion of what we do in this committee, $647 billion. That's not counting OCO. Throw OCO in there and it's $716 billion. The budget cap number for 2020 is, I believe, $567 billion. So it would be, gosh, about an $80 billion cut in what we did in FY19. Are you planning on having to absorb that cut, or are you hoping that there will be some way to avoid the Budget Control Act come 2020 and 2021?
Sir, we will lay out the requirement for 20 and 21. However, our internal reforms, we are looking to accrue savings there. At the same time, we're going to have a budget fit for its time, and I can't tell you what the threat specifically will be. I can tell you we're trying to put ourselves in a position to have a shock absorber where we can take those threats on board and maintain budget predictability. That includes requests from us. But for right now, I would just suggest that in light of the percent of the GDP we're putting out for military security, for defense, America can afford survival, and our job is to make certain what we bring to you is only what's required. And that's, I don't want to lock myself into the future, right, since I don't have the
I'm sorry,
but
ball. If I may interpret that, basically what you're saying is you believe that if we go back to the budget caps in 2020 and 2021, we will be putting the country at risk, and you do not accept that number, and you are not planning on that number.
Sir, I owe you my best.
Yeah, no, I just want your honest opinion. So.
Right. I mean, I'd love to see the budget go down in the world that we're looking at out there. I don't think that's going to be the case.
Right. Well, you don't think that that would put us in a position to provide for the national security if the budget went back to the cap numbers in FY20 and 21?
I do not, sir.
Okay. And the problem with that, of course, is the debt and deficit that I talked about. And I would just say for my colleagues that, you know, whatever disagreements we may have on exactly what the number for the defense budget should be, we are headed towards an enormous problem unless we can continue to borrow north of $1 trillion every year, basically forever. So there are some big picture budget things that we need to deal with, even if we disagree on the exact number for the defense budget going forward. It's going to create, we're going to be right back in the uncertainty about a year from now if we don't come up with some comprehensive approach to our budget challenge. Last thing I'll say is, you know, I think given the budget that we face, we have to try to find ways to save money as much as possible. And we've had this discussion before. I just want to put it on the record. I don't think we need to spend $1.2 trillion modernizing our nuclear weapons. We certainly need to modernize them. But again, I'll emphasize, I've said this before in hearings, China has 275 nuclear weapons. That's it. We have 15, 20 times as many. They have set up a deterrence, a very, very credible deterrence, because a lot of people don't know, but nuclear weapons these days are, I think, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the one that dropped on Hiroshima. We ought to be able to come up with a nuclear deterrent strategy that costs us a lot less money. And also, if there are fewer nuclear weapons out there, not just on our side, granted, but on all sides, there is less risk of stumbling into a nuclear war. So I am deeply concerned about the nuclear modification plan, both in terms of what it really does for our national security, the risks it places for a nuclear conflict, and also just for the budget. Because I'll say this, I'm 100% with the chairman on the readiness crisis and the way you described it. We are not providing the equipment or the training for our troops that we should right now to make sure that they're ready. I want to find money wherever I can to make sure that we are, and that's one big area that I'm going to be looking at. If it's okay, I'll just, you can send me your comments for the record. I want to let other people get in, but I just wanted to put that on the record. I yield back.
As all members were notified, we're going to pick up the questioning today where we left off when the Secretary was with us in February. And so Mr. Lamborn is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you both for your service to our country. So for either or both of you, everyone knows that Russia is in violation of the INF Treaty. Do you expect the Russians to return anytime soon to full and verifiable compliance with that treaty?
Right now, Congressman, we have very modest expectations that they would return to compliance. As a result, in the nuclear posture review, we are looking for a way at the lowest possible cost to checkmate them and make it in their best interest to return to compliance.
General Dunford, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I would say, Congressman, is that one of the things we are doing in this budget that we've submitted is there is research and development for non-compliant weapons that is allowed by the treaty, and that is in the budget for FY19. So we're not only looking for operational concepts and ways to deal with the Russian violation, but we're also at least posturing ourselves to develop weapons should they be required.
And I think we should stress the point that even as we stay in the treaty, although I'm skeptical that they're going to come back into compliance, and we're kind of unilaterally tying our hands behind our back, we are legitimately allowed to do research for non-compliant systems. Is that not correct?
That is correct, and we are doing that. It is in the budget, Congressman. As we modernize this nuclear deterrent, our effort will also be matched at State Department by movement on arms control and nonproliferation. There are two thrusts to our nuclear strategy. And so as a result, we've got to do something that would make it in Russia's best interest to return to compliance. And that's why those funds have been requested.
Well, I'm glad they are being requested. And how important is it to have additional options in our nuclear stockpile to address possible threats in the future?
In order to keep a deterrent fit for its time, it has got to be one that adjusts to any changes that we see an adversary or potential adversary making. And in this case, you'll notice that there are several adaptations. One of them is to return possibly the nuclear cruise missiles to the Navy ships. We had them there before. A second one is to put a small number of low-yield weapons on board Navy submarines, ballistic missile submarines. This is because we have uncovered, and Russia's been rather out front with the idea that they could escalate to de-escalate. What that means is use a low-yield nuclear weapon in a conventional war to compel surrender, basically. And our point is to say you can't do that. We are going to have a low-yield weapon. We're not confronted only by using a high yield, which they believe we would not do. In order to make certain that the deterrent works, they must know that we don't have a choice only between surrender or suicide. So that is why we are doing these kind of adaptations to stay fit for our time.
I'm really glad to hear that, because as we go into the budget, some folks may argue that having additional options is destabilizing. We all want as much stability as possible when it comes to these powerful weapons. So it's your belief that it's stabilizing to have more options. Is that not correct?
The entire point of that nuclear modernization is to maintain a nuclear deterrent that stabilizes and deters any use of the weapon. Then that is why we have looked at the research and development as authorized under the treaty, for one. It is why we're looking at the low-yield weapon as well. It actually raises the deterrent effect of what we have and actually reduces the chance of nuclear war.
Thank you so much. I appreciate what you do for our country. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And I appreciate the gentleman keeping all questions and answers within 5 minutes. Let me encourage everybody to do that so we can get to as many people as possible. Mr. Courtney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both witnesses. I appreciate the remarks regarding the passage of the omnibus on March 21st. Again, Secretary Mattis, you noted the fact that it was a bipartisan effort. I think it's important to note that not only was it bipartisan, but neither caucus by itself was able to deliver the votes to actually pass it by itself. So it truly took a coalition of people who, again, I think have heeded your repeated testimony over the last 2 or 3 years about the harm that the sequestration caps were causing in terms of readiness and other issues. So again, you were a big part of the external effort to get us to that point, and obviously to create a 2-year horizon with the bipartisan budget agreement. Secretary Mattis, on page 3 of your testimony, it states that the 2018 National Defense Strategy provides clear strategic direction for America's military to reclaim an era of strategic purpose, which is, I think, a very, high aspirational goal for our country, to get sort of a clear picture that budgets are tied to a stable strategy. Unfortunately, just the events of the last 2 weeks, we have comments coming out of the White House that regarding Syria, which I think really are sort of disconnected to that goal. On March 28th, the president was giving a speech on infrastructure where he, again, without any prompting, talked about wanting to leave Syria, quote unquote, very soon. Again, when the Pentagon was asked about that, they referred the media to the White House to get an explanation. On April 3rd, at a joint appearance with the presidents of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, again, he doubled down, saying that they want to get out, that the U.S. wants to get out. On the 4th, said it would be within a few months. And then on April 7th, we had obviously the chemical attack, which again resulted in a gyration of comments coming out of the White House talking about missile attacks. And then yesterday morning, Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming nice and new and smart. Again, in terms of trying to align those messages with a clear strategic direction for our country, I'm not asking you to answer any questions about operational decisions that you are considering right now, but what is the policy, the Department of Defense regarding, and strategy regarding the Assad regime, its future, and the Syrian civil war, or is there a strategy?
Yes, sir. Well, and thank you for your comments about my role in the bipartisan omnibus, sir. But I would tell you that without this committee's bipartisanship that you have right in this room, I think my comments would have been whistling in the dark. I think it was the example you set on Syria, sir. Both the last administration and this one made very clear that our role in Syria is the defeat of ISIS. We are not going to engage in the civil war itself. Now, you can look back to a year ago when we did fire missiles into Syria unrelated to ISIS, and that was, of course, the use of chemical weapons. And some things are simply inexcusable, beyond the pale, and in the worst interest of not just the Chemical Weapons Convention, but of civilization itself. And so the recognition of that means at times you're going to see contrary impulses. You saw President Obama try to deal with those chemical weapons when he was in and enlisting the Russians, who now it shows were complicit in Syria retaining those weapons, Assad retaining them. And the only reason Assad is still in power is because of the Russians' regrettable vetoes in the UN and the Russian and Iranian military. So how do we deal with this very complex situation? First of all, we are committed to ending that war through the Geneva process and the UN-orchestrated effort. It has been unfulfilled because, again, Russia has continually blocked the efforts. But that doesn't mean we give up. We work with the international community, the United Nations, to get the Geneva process underway and make certain that we don't allow this war to go on. I've seen refugees from Asia to Europe, Kosovo, to Africa. I've never seen refugees as traumatized as coming out of Syria. It's got to end, and our strategy remains the same as a year ago. It is to drive this to a UN-brokered peace, but at the same time keep our foot on the neck of ISIS until we suffocate it.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, Mr. Norquist, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for your service. Secretary Mattis, I want to begin by going to your words in your statement when you talked about the downward trajectory of our Navy inventory and of Navy lethality. In response to that, last year, this committee authorized $26.2 billion and 13 warships. I think many of us were bitterly disappointed when the appropriators cut that number to $23.7 billion and 10 warships. And I know that our effort now this year is going to be to continue the path of rebuilding the readiness and capability within our Navy. And obviously the Navy Marine Corps team needs that on the mission going forward. In your testimony, you state the fleet will continue to grow to meet capabilities needed in the future and maintain an industrial base healthy enough to adapt and evolve in a dynamic environment. I'm still concerned, though. As you saw last year, we authorized $26 billion, essentially appropriated $24 billion. Essentially, this year, the FY19 request was for $21 billion for shipbuilding. And I expected more because we had lifted the caps last year, so I thought there may be, as you talked about, a response to that downward trajectory. Mr. Secretary, let me ask this. If given the resources, does our military have the need for additional submarines? Do we have a more efficient and effective way to purchase aircraft carriers? And could we build amphibious ships for our Marines on a more cost-effective timeline?
Sir, we always need more submarines. We always need more ships. And in a perfect world, I would tell you right now that I would have a 350-ship Navy. But I have to deal with where the ball lies, not where I want it to be. I think that as you looked at the trade-offs and the balance as we tried to go forward with current capability, with the future capability, with the growing challenges in space and cyberspace that have got to be accommodated, we probably did very well on shipbuilding. Now, can we get more affordable aircraft carriers? We not only can, we will. You will not see another one that goes through what you all experienced as you went down to Norfolk and saw that beautiful ship. But it's too late, it's over budget, and there are ways to prevent that in the future. So we're going to make better use of the dollars and make a more affordable Navy. There are some strategic decisions to be made about how we do that, to include what we do in cyberspace and space so each ship is more capable. But also, I would just tell you that this is part of an integrated force, and nobody can integrate their forces in the world better than we can right now.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to talk a little bit about the Ready Reserve Force. It's projected that our Ready Reserve Force will carry over 90% of readiness lift if called upon. And our Ready Reserve Force today, 46 ships, averages 43 years old. In fact, we maintain some of the only steam plants left in the world on board ships. They're essentially floating Smithsonian Institute displays. Some have speculated that in a conflict, the limiting factor is going to be sea lift. General Dunford, I know you had talked a little bit about that, about where we are with that. What steps is the department pursuing to address this, what I believe is a strategic deficiency?
I want to take that for the record, sir. I've met with the commander of Military Sea Lift Command. There is a way to make some of the ships more capable right now, simply modernize them at relatively cheap price. And we're also going to have to buy certain types of ships in the future. I believe that right now we've got a pretty good plan for it. It's the prioritization of it. And what does the Army really need to bring? As you know, the Army's trying to adapt as well, and that has significant impact on what is the requirement. And I want to make certain I get the requirement right so I don't come in and tell you that I built something I didn't need, and 5 years from now I need to beach it. I'll get back to you with something on that, sir.
Very good. Thanks, Secretary Mattis. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Tsongas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to you both. I appreciate your being here before us. I, too, would like to focus on Syria. The chemical weapons attack against innocent civilians in Syria over the weekend is but the latest tragic atrocity in that country. Secretary Mattis, you referenced the refugee crisis. Human Rights Watch has reported at least 86 verified chemical weapons attacks there. So we know what a terrible situation exists there. But in response to the most recent attack, the President has signaled that the administration is reviewing possible military action. There are compelling uncertainties surrounding renewed strikes in Syria. Just to name a few, how these actions fit into a broader Syria strategy, which you've tried to address in some form, the nature of the support from the international partners who share our condemnation of Assad's atrocities, and how any renewed action in Syria, particularly should it escalate into a broader conflict, would impact our ability to engage in other areas of concern around the world, not the least of which also what it might require of us in that part of the world as well, in Syria. So these concerns are not de minimis or passing, and I hope that you would agree that it is clearly time for Congress to review existing authorizations for use of military force and to engage in the considered debate these times require. But as we speak, the administration is reviewing possible military courses of action, so I appreciate the timing of your appearance here today. So as you're considering possible steps forward, military actions you might take, what do you hope to achieve by any military action that the administration might eventually decide to take?
Congresswoman, I don't want to get, as you'll understand, into the details of a potential decision by the Commander-in-Chief due to this latest attack, which is absolutely inexcusable. There have been a number of these attacks. In many cases, you know, we don't have troops. We're not engaged on the ground there. So I cannot tell you that we had evidence, even though we certainly had a lot of media and social media indicators that either chlorine or sarin were used. As far as our current situation, if, like last time, we decide we have to take military action in regard to this chemical weapons attack, then like last time, we will be reporting to Congress just as we did when we fired a little over a year ago, slightly over a year ago. As far as the counter-violent extremists, counter-ISIS...
So let me go back to this. So before taking any action, you would report to Congress as to the nature of what that action might be? I
will speak only to the fact that we will report to Congress. We'll keep open lines of communication. There will be notification to the leadership, of course, prior to the attack, but we'll give a full report to the Congress itself, probably as rapidly as possible. On the counter-violence...
And so let's just stick with this. I'd also then like to know, would you take action absent support from our allies? I know that the administration is engaged in talks with France and the UK. Would you seek to have them involved in any action we might take?
As you know, ma'am, Congresswoman, our
would that be a precondition?
Strategy is to engage by, with, and through allies in all things we do. I do not want to discuss the current situation because I owe confidentiality to our allies due to the sensitive nature of military operations and the need to keep those secret. But I think you'll find nothing inconsistent with your view in what we're doing without going into any details.
And what worries you most about any military action we might take, given the very highly complex landscape in Syria, the many actors that are engaged there?
Well, there's a tactical concern, ma'am, that innocent people, we don't add to any civilian deaths and do everything humanly possible to avoid that. We're trying to stop the murder of innocent people. But on a strategic level, it's how do we keep this from escalating out of control, if you get my drift on that.
I get your drift. Thank you. I yield back.
Okay.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, thank you so much for your years of dedicated service to the United States. Secretary Mattis, you mentioned that in previous testimony today that we don't have confirmation yet whether or not there was a chemical attack. Don't we reasonably have enough evidence to certainly to believe that there was an attack, and the fact that they didn't, the Russians and the Syrian Assad government did not grant immediate access, I believe that was requested. Could you speak to that?
I can, Congressman. I believe there was a chemical attack, and we're looking for the actual evidence. The OPCW, this is the Organization for the Chemical Weapons Convention. We're trying to get those inspectors in probably within the week. You know the challenges we face, where Russia has 6 times in the UN rejected and made certain that we could not get investigators in. We will not know from this investigating team that goes in, if we get them in, if the regime will let them in, we will not know who did it. They can only say that they found evidence or did not. And as each day goes by, as you know, it's a non-persistent gas, so it becomes more and more difficult to confirm it. So that's where we're at right now, sir.
Okay, thank you. Just a question on the light attack aircraft. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the Air Force is currently testing a light attack aircraft that may be acquired by the Department for use as a cost-effective way to provide close air support of counterinsurgency, armed reconnaissance, and other combat operations in a more when in a more permissive threat environment. I think an F-22 was recently used to attack a Taliban drug lab. I think that's $70,000 an hour in terms of the operational cost, and a light attack aircraft, I think it's approximately about $1,000 in terms of its operational costs an hour. I wonder if you could speak to having them in our inventory as we're, again, in a low-threat environment where we don't have air-to-air threat, where we have a limited ground-to-air threat, and also be able to sell those in terms of foreign military sales to our allies that can't afford an F-35 aircraft, and that to foster a better military relationship with many of our allies. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, yes, sir. Congressman, you hit on all the right points, sir. We are looking for affordability, and where we don't need an aircraft that costs $17,000, $20,000, $70,000 per flight hour, we need to look at it as a way to deliver readiness and combat capability on an affordable basis. And we are looking at it. As you know, the Chief of Staff Air Force personally flew in one to check it out, and I think you hit on all the right points there about why we're looking at this, sir.
Okay. General Dunford.
Congressman, the role I play is to identify the capability that the force needs. What you've described as a capability that we need. And the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I know, is committed to delivering that low-end capability at the most cost-effective way possible, and that's really why these trials are ongoing. So we support his attempt to get that capability at the best cost we can, meeting the criteria you outlined.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your service. Mr. Secretary, approximately how many transgender troops are currently deployed?
I do not know, Congresswoman.
Could you provide that to us subsequently?
I think I can. I'll give you the best data I can come up with on it, yes.
Do you believe that the currently serving transgender troops are weakening readiness or reducing lethality?
Congresswoman, on this one, I submitted my recommendation and put it out publicly, my recommendation to the President. It's a highly charged issue from some people's perspective, and it is under litigation right now. So out of respect for the courts, I'll just tell you the current policy stays in effect, the last administration's policy as directed by the courts. And I've submitted to the President what I think is the best military advice.
So, Mr. Secretary, I want to introduce you to Staff Sergeant Logan Ireland. He was a non-commissioned officer of the quarter when he was deployed to Afghanistan. He is also transgender. Do you believe that currently serving transgender troops like Staff Sergeant Ireland are a burden to our military?
Congresswoman, I think that as we look at the enlistment standards, I gave a recommendation that troops, patriotic Americans who do not have gender dysphoria should be allowed to serve. I did not recommend that we change the clear standards that apply to all in that regard, or make a special group, and I'd prefer to leave the courts to their action at this point and then see where they stand at the end of it, and then look at what I've recommended to the President when I can answer you more fully.
Well, Mr. Secretary, you rolled out this new policy, and now you're basically saying I'm not prepared to defend it.
Oh, I'm prepared to defend it, ma'am, but out of respect for the courts, I do not intrude into something that it would be inappropriate for me to say something that would somehow impact in a court case that's going on. I think this is a rather standard situation once the courts engage.
Were there any non-governmental individuals or organizations involved in the formulation of the recommendations by the DOD to the President?
It was the best military advice I could draw from civilian overseers and military personnel, both officer and senior enlisted.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like you to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters from medical groups refuting the conclusions of the DOD report on military service by transgender individuals, in which they say no medically valid reasons exist to exclude.
Without objection, whatever letters the gentlelady would like to enter into the record may be included.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, a Military Times article this week revealed that the Defense Manpower Data Center failed to report the number of combat troops deployed in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan last quarter. That website was also stripped of deployment data from previous quarters. I'm very concerned about that. I think that there's no combat advantage to obfuscating the number of U.S. service members that were in these countries 3 months ago, and furthermore, the American public has a right to know. Do you intend to restore that information to the website?
I'll look at it, Congresswoman. As you know, we keep the Congress fully informed right down to every week. We can update you on exactly the numbers in each case, and we do maintain some degree of confidentiality over the number of troops engaged against enemies in the field. So I'll have to look at it, but we will not, of course, ever keep those numbers away from members of Congress for your oversight.
Well, I know, but this has been an ongoing website that's provided this information to the public, and all of a sudden, the last quarter, it's not posted, and they've swept away all the data for previous quarters. So it would suggest to, I think, the public and to members of this Congress that you are no longer going to make that information available, and I think the public has a right to know.
I see. Well, when I come in, ma'am, I don't come in intending to hide things, but I would just ask, what would you do if you thought the enemy could take advantage of that kind of data, seeing trends at certain times of the year and what they can expect in the future? But I'll certainly look at it. I share your conviction that the American people should know everything that doesn't give the enemy an advantage.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to certainly commend you and your leadership, all of you, to make sure that our force is ready, capable, and able, and deployable, and so I appreciate the policies that and the positions that you are advancing. And I would like to ask, bring up the topic of base security as it relates to rogue and careless drones. What many people don't realize is that under Title 18, to interdict a drone, it's illegal to do that because they're viewed as an aircraft or a protected computer. And in the NDAA of 17 and 18, as you know, we did give DOD some new authorities to go after them, which I certainly applaud, but they are limited to certain areas like nuclear deterrence, missile defense, air defense, assistance, and protecting the president and vice president. So I'm wondering, and I'm concerned about other DOD facilities, and specifically a couple of things in Missouri makes me think of Mobility Command, makes me think of also training bases and the potential danger or threat with a rogue drone on those missions. So I was wondering, how is the Department of Defense interpreting the authorities provided by the FY18 NDAA, and should this authority be expanded to all DOD mission sets, or perhaps to other specific missions like mobility and training that aren't currently included?
Congresswoman, I'll start, and maybe the Secretary will add something. The Secretary, when the legislation was passed, brought together all the service chiefs and leadership to look at this issue, both from a material solution perspective as well as from an authorities perspective. And he made it pretty clear that if we have a threat to our forces, to our bases, that we had the authorization. So we've interpreted it as we have the authorization to protect our people. There are still some gaps in our material solutions to be able to do that. I'm satisfied that particularly for our sensitive sites, we've addressed that, but we perhaps haven't produced the equipment and the volume that we would want to see to be able to protect all of our facilities and so forth. But I've been in the room a couple of times with the Secretary, and I feel like our leadership has interpreted the law to mean that we can protect our bases and protect our people.
So you said there are some gaps, though. Would you like to see those addressed in the next NDAA?
What we're addressing now are the material solution gaps. In other words, making sure we have the right amount of equipment out there in the hands of our people across all of our bases and stations.
That's great.
We also have authority gaps, though, Congresswoman. You're exactly right about the threat. We see what they're doing overseas. We know it's coming to a place near us back here. We do need more authorities, and we will outline what those should look like, because you indicate that we can protect our nuclear sites. That's accurate, but we have a lot of other sensitive situations that are basically left outside the authority. So we owe to you what we think that authority should look like and make our case.
Great, thank you for that. And the National Defense Strategy, rightfully so, highlighted the long-term strategic competition with China as one of the central challenges to national security. As you know, China is very focused. They have multiple lanes of effort, from espionage to the military effort to counterintelligence to propaganda arm, et cetera. And there are multiple lines of efforts in OSD policy, the Joint Staff, across services, and the combatant commands that look at these issues. Who is the focal point for such coordination across policy, across the services, across the commands?
Inside DOD, it would be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. However, there's a broader issue here, a defend the nation, a holistic, and that falls under Secretary Nielsen of Homeland Defense. And in that case, we have confronted a number of vulnerabilities that have not been fully addressed, and we are putting together the interagency effort to outline the holistic approach to that defense.
Very good. I know we only have 28 seconds, but China, as you know, is beyond just the Indo-Pacific in their influence and their goals. Their activities are present Africa, Europe, Latin America, et cetera. What efforts are you aware of being taken by each of the combatant commands in the different AORs to counter the China challenge?
Congressman, we have, in the time remaining, we have a global campaign plan for China. Each one of the combatant commanders addresses China in the context of that global campaign plan. Admiral Harris, as the Pacific Command, is the coordinating authority for that global campaign plan, but each one of the combatant commanders has supporting plans in their respective areas of responsibility that address specifically Chinese activity and capability in their areas.
Could I have a copy of that, or maybe be briefed on that?
We will make sure you get briefed on that, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that everyone on the panel today is very concerned about what happened in Niger with the 4 soldiers that were killed there. And what I want to ask you today are about the risk that we're accepting by responding to crisis or incidents on the continent of Africa, and wondered if you could comment on those risks, and can we respond to multiple threats around the world, particularly when you look at Africa and how large that footprint is under our current defense budget restraints that we have.
Representative, you hit on a key point for why our second line of effort, 3 lines of effort, the second one is building allies and partnerships. What we want to do is address those kinds of issues, whether it be in the Pacific or in Africa Command in Europe, by, with, and through our allies. So when we go in, let's just take Africa for an example, I actually look at how many troops we're going to invest against how many, in this case, African troops are we going to then be training or bringing into the fight. And it looks like an investment chart right out of corporate America. 1 American equals how many trained and ready troops who can defend their own country. So our goal is to turn this to the right people, and that's the people whose country it is. And that is the way we go about it. We don't try to take on the full mission. We do a needs assessment of that specific country. In the case of the Sahel area, and you know Boko Haram and the threat that's there, in that case, the French are leading the effort as the leading nation, and the African nations are gathered around France, and we support France and the African nations. So you can see how we're doing this by, with, and through our allies, so we don't carry the burden.
When if we were to cut the State Department budget, and of course they work on things like governance that are very key, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, on making sure that these countries know how to govern themselves accordingly, so we don't have to spend as much militarily. If we cut back on those particular efforts, how much more money would we need to be able to invest, and how much more risk would we need to take on the continent of Africa under those sort of restraints? I would imagine you would need more U.S. military power to be able to address, again, just because of the expanse of the continent.
And Congressman, just to follow up on what the Secretary is saying, and I think this is where you were going with your question, you know, we have approximately 1,000 forces in West Africa. The French have over 4,000, and we're working with some 20 to 30,000 partners on the ground. So the requirement is for somewhere north of 30,000 forces to actually do the job, and our investment is only 1,000. So if your question is, what would it take if we were doing it by ourselves? You know, it would take on a large order of magnitude greater than what we're investing right now. That's what by, with, and through really means, is a small U.S. footprint leveraging local capability to actually do the work that needs to be done to address terrorism, extremism in the region.
Congressman, I work very, very closely with my counterpart at State, with Secretary Tillerson. As you know, I'm now working with Secretary Sullivan, Deputy Secretary, as nominee Pompeo goes through his hearing today. But I can assure you that, for example, when we have a small amount of development money given us through this committee, we meet with State, we align State and defense development money so that there's an integrated effort. So everything we do is done to enable our diplomats to speak with more authority and to reinforce the foreign policy of the administration, largely put together by State Department. So they have the lead, we reinforce, and it's been a good team, sir, all the way through.
For the continent, though, is the best strategy governance or military right now? Like, what would help those countries in Africa? Is it more of a governance issue?
Most of the challenges they face, Congressman, are not militarily solvable. It needs better governance, it needs diplomacy, it needs development, and we are working with State Department in support of those efforts. But it is, I know what you're driving at, and I agree with you that it is a diplomatically led effort.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Good morning here. First question, General Mattis, Secretary Mattis. You have a joint program office with the Coast Guard and the Navy right now for icebreakers. There's no joint strategy on icebreakers. Coast Guard has their own Arctic strategy and the Navy has their own Arctic strategy, and I was wondering if it had entered your mind to combine those into a joint Arctic strategy.
We work, as you know, very closely. I don't hold a meeting with the chairman and the 4-stars without the commandant of the Coast Guard in the room. So we intend to stay collaborative. We have different authorities, different missions, but they need to be integrated in the Arctic. Certainly, we have not prioritized the Arctic right now due to the other situations from Korea and Syria to the situation vis-a-vis Russia. South China Sea, but
wouldn't Russia be a reason to increase? Wouldn't Russia be a reason to increase our presence in the Arctic?
I think what we increase there is what we would look at. What type of forces? Clearly, search and rescue in the Arctic is a high priority. Environmental protection is. Some of these things are not fit, are not best done by the U.S. military. But I would have no problem supporting Department of Homeland Security, Coast Guard efforts in the Arctic. We work closely together on every other part, from the Caribbean to the Persian Gulf. So I'm sure it's an area we'll work together.
Thank you. Last question. The funding requests from everything for the MSP, the Ready Reserve Fleet, basically the logistics train that you would use to go to war. You didn't request full funding for the MSP ships. That's the Maritime Security Program. You requested the old funding, which is over $3.5 million versus $5 million a ship. General McDew is now working on, for the first time ever, looking at if we take casualties with our ships as they load our gear. And I remember when I deployed in 2004, we loaded a Ro-Ro in San Diego with all of our gear and then flew over to Kuwait and fell in on our stuff. If you don't have the gear, you can't go to war. You might have the people there and you might have the first stage, but you won't be able to continue that. Our Ready Reserve Fleet is falling apart. It's done. It's a steam engine powered fleet, which is ridiculous. The MSP is going to be underfunded now. You might see people dropping out of that. So what are your thoughts and the grand strategy of aligning the effectiveness and the killing end of the military with the guys that are going to make it work, which is being able to get the gear there to sustain a battle?
Right. Projecting power, Congressman, you're quite right. That is a key area of concern, and we're trying to prioritize inside many demands on the budget. But I've met with the Military Sealift Command commander, and we are going to come up with a way to get out of the situation we've inherited. It's going to have to be prioritized. I think that the mobility requirement study that comes in later this year, I would say probably by October, maybe November, is going to actually have a part of it that focuses right on what is the problem, not in general terms, what is the specific problem, what needs to be moved, what capability do we need, and how do we go forward. The problem has not been sufficiently defined yet. We see all the symptoms of the problem. We need to really get it right before we start spending, hundreds of millions of dollars on this.
I can't even tell when my voice is good enough for both. North Korea boost phase shoot down. The same system would work in Kuwait, shooting down boost phase out of Iran to Western Europe or to Southeast Europe. You'd have the same system, roughly the same geography and trajectories. So just can you give us an update on how, instead of waiting until the missile's coming down out of space at us, we're shooting at it, how we're doing on shooting it as it's low and slow and going up into the air?
Congressman, we're looking at left of launch, prior to launch, and we're looking at boost phase. I'd prefer to do that in private with you, give you that brief because of the current nature of the threat.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your service, and particularly in this very difficult period of time. In response to Ms. Sangus's questions, you dealt with a lot of the issues of Syria, and I want to pick up one additional one. The horrific use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime has prompted the President to threaten military action. My question, Secretary Mattis, is very specific. What is the legal authority, the precise legal authority of the United States government to engage in military action in response to the chemical weapons use by the Assad regime?
Right. I believe that authority is under Article 2. We have forces in the field, as you know, in Syria, and the use of chemical weapons in Syria is not something that we should assume that, well, because he didn't use them on us this time, he wouldn't use them on us next time. So for right now, I'll have the lawyers get back to you with the broader issue. I'm aware of where your question goes, sir. But I would just tell you that, that we have got to look at the use of chemical weapons, whether it be in Salisbury, England, or in Syria, as something that's inexcusable and that's got to be addressed. And as Russia prevents the United Nations from dealing with it, we can sit acquiescent or we can do something about it.
So you do not believe you need further congressional authority to respond to the chemical weapons attack with military kinetic action?
Under Article 2, sir, the President has the right to employ the military. There are war powers resolutions. There are other actions that or legislative actions that cause us to come to you, as you know, with reports. But at the same time, I think we have the authority to deal with this.
Are you prepared to deliver to this committee the precise legal authority in writing that you're referring to?
Well, sir, again, protection of our forces, I don't think we have to wait until they're under chemical attack when the weapons are used in the same theater we're operating in.
I understand that, but I'm awaiting a legal document from the Department of Defense specifying the exact authority and circumstances that cause you to use that protection of forces.
Okay. Yes, sir. I'll provide it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I think it's necessary. Obviously, there will be a debate about this. In your testimony, you indicated that there's some $12 billion for missile defense. that that's an imminent threat to the United States. There's also a week ago, actually 2 weeks ago, from the Department of Homeland Security, an imminent threat from Russia hacking into critical infrastructure systems in the United States. What is the Department of Defense doing to defend against those kinds of attacks that could easily lead to the shutdown of the grid or some other critical infrastructure, thereby bringing physical as well as social and economic harm to the United States?
Right. Sir, as you know, we have a fair amount of money that's given to our Cyber Command for cyberspace operations, and we have a number of mission teams, but these are primarily Congressman, focused on our own defense of the Department of Defense and offense against an adversary. For the Defend the Nation mission that comes under the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Nielsen, we are in close contact with her. We have the only capability to try and defend, whether it be an electrical grid, a financial system, something like that. And I think that right now we need to get a lot stronger in the defense of our critical infrastructure, all aspects of it. And I realize that some of that could come under the Department of Defense, which is going to take congressional initiative and action in order to balance the constitutional safeguards for our citizens with the reality that we've got to be able to protect them. And this is an area that needs a lot of work. I'll be the first to admit it.
If I might just, in a hearing that Ms. Stefanik had yesterday, it became very, very clear that the coordination between the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Defense is lacking. I appreciate your attention to it.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to follow up on that a little bit. And I know Secretary Mattis and the National Defense Strategy, you discussed the need to be strategically predictable, but operationally unpredictable. We're spending an increasing amount of time on gray zone conflicts. Obviously, if we have evidence that somebody used a chemical weapon, that's a line that we can see. We know we want a predictable response to that so that that doesn't happen again. But with gray zone conflicts, that line sometimes doesn't seem to exist. And so, Chairman Dunford, as we talk about these gray zones, can you discuss the implications of the potential for future proxy war? Might not be the right term, but certainly could work there. And is this going to be the way in the future that our adversaries challenge our resolve as a country, both to operate on behalf of ourselves and our allies?
Congressman, I think the answer to the end of the question is yes, it is what we see, and particularly with nations that we have a competitive advantage in the conventional space. They realize they can't take us on conventionally, so they find another way. To put a finer point on gray zone, I would describe that as political influence, economic coercion, use of cyber, use of information operations, and then military posture. So there's a military dimension to it, but it's clearly a broader problem than just a military dimension. As we think about it in the military strategy, we think the competition that's taking place in that gray zone is really the competition for our allies and partners. So we believe that the critical thing that they're trying to do in the gray zone in the military space is undermine the credibility of our alliances and partnerships, which, as the Secretary outlined, is an important line of effort in the National Defense Strategy. So what's critical for us to do is overcome in the information space, overcome in cyber capabilities, and then our military posture, the erosion of that relationship that we have with our allies. The broader government piece is, in fact, what we're going to see, and that is going to require the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, all to come together to be competitive in what you described as the gray zone. And as I mentioned, it really does have a political and economic, a military, and an informational aspect.
And so if I could follow up, it's going to take an all-of-government approach on the Homeland Defense side of the gray zone conflicts. What authorities do you have to take offensive action in the gray zone?
I think, Congressman, what you get at is a really important point, and that is that we have traditionally, and we do today, distinguished between peace and war. And so the activities and the authorities that we have in place on a day-to-day basis reflect the fact that we're at peace. And our adversaries don't actually have the same restraints. So what they're doing on a day-to-day basis looks more like moving towards war than being in peace. And so from a cyber perspective and information operations perspective, we are reviewing and we are reviewing that issue, and we do believe that we are limited in the activities that we can perform on a day-to-day basis and the authorities that we have to allow us to be competitive.
This is something that I know as a member of Congress we're going to need help from people that understand these definitions and operations significantly better than I do, and look forward to your help with the authorities and other things that you need to not only defend the homeland, but to take action against those who are taking these actions against us. General Mattis, as I mentioned, the strategic predictability and operational unpredictability is outlined in the National Defense Strategy. Can you briefly describe what this means for troop rotations and overseas assignments and training?
I can, Congressman. What we will do is make certain our allies know that we're reliable and we can break through to them, we can get to them and stand with them at the time of need. We will do it by making certain that keeping the maintenance of the equipment, the training of the troops, and the family wear and tear on the families is all kept in balance. The way you do this is we ensure that preparation for great power competition drives us, not simply a rotation schedule that allows me to tell you 3 years from now which aircraft carrier will be where in the world. That's a great way to run a shipping line. It's no way to run a Navy. So during the time when they would be authorized to deploy, directed to deploy, they may not deploy out of home waters. They may stay there operating an aircraft carrier down off San Diego, operating with the Army at Fort Irwin, overhead cover, this sort of thing as we keep our joint force ready. And then when we send them out, it may be for a shorter deployment. There will be 3 carriers in the South China Sea today. And then 2 weeks from now, there's only 1 there, and 2 of them are in the Indian Ocean. They'll be home at the end of a 90-day deployment. They will not have spent 8 months at sea, and we are going to have a force more ready to surge and deal with the high-end warfare as a result without breaking the families, the maintenance cycles, or reducing. We will actually enhance the training time. Does that give you a
yes, sir.
Appreciation for it?
Gentlemen, thank you for your service.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. You know, the President has indicated recently his intention to launch U.S. military attacks against Syria. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. Congress has not done so against the Syrian government. Section 3 of the War Powers Resolution requires the President to consult with Congress before introducing U.S. armed forces into situations of hostilities. Section 2 of the War Powers Resolution clarifies the constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief in Article 2, which you referenced, Secretary Mattis, to introduce forces into hostilities only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by an attack upon the U.S., its territories, possessions, or armed forces. Syria has not declared war against the U.S. or threatened the U.S. The launch of 59 missiles against Syria by Trump last year was illegal and did not meet any of those criteria in the War Powers Resolution. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018, which was signed into law by President Trump, states that none of the funds made available by this act may be used with respect to Syria in contravention of the War Powers Resolution, including for the introduction of U.S. armed military forces into hostilities in Syria. My question is, will the President uphold the Constitution, the War Powers Resolution, and comply with the law that he signed by obtaining authorization from Congress before launching U.S. military attacks against Syria?
Congresswoman, we have not yet made any decision to launch military attacks into Syria. I think that when you look back at President Obama sending the U.S. troops into Syria, at the time he did, he also had to deal with this type of situation because we were going after a named terrorist group that was not actually named in the AUMF. that put them in. This is a complex area, I'll be the first to admit.
It is simple, however, what the Constitution requires. So while you're correct in saying the President has not yet made a decision, my question is, will he abide by the Constitution and comply with the law?
Yeah, I believe that the President will carry out his duties under the Constitution to protect the country.
What would the objective of an attack on Syria be, and how does that serve the interests of the American people?
I don't want to talk about a specific attack that is not yet in the offing, knowing that these are decisions. This would be pre-decisional. Again, the President has not made that decision. However, looking at the Chemical Warfare Convention, I think it's by far in the best interest of civilization, certainly in the best interest of America, that that convention be obeyed by the nations that have signed it. And what has happened in Salisbury, England, and now has happened in Syria again, shows that this is not an idle concern.
So if the decision is made, as you have stated publicly, you're laying all the options on the table for the President, if the decision is made to launch a military attack against Syria, Russia has already responded, saying that they would respond to our U.S. strike. As this action is considered, can you justify for the American people how going to war with Russia over Syria serves the interests of the American people?
No, Congresswoman, I can't answer that question. I'm not ready to speculate that that would happen.
Would you not say that it is a highly likely occurrence given what Russia has stated directly, that they will respond?
No, Congresswoman, I would not. And there's a lot of ways to respond to the violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, diplomatically, economically, militarily,
sure,
that taken in total would represent, I think, what we have to do in this world if we're going to turn it over in accordance with international norms and international law.
One last question. The 2001 AUMF is the authorization with which our U.S. forces are in Syria today. While ISIS, there's been much progress made in the counter-ISIS campaign, and they're close to being defeated in Syria. Al-Qaeda has grown stronger. Brett McGurk stated just over a year ago that al-Nusra is now Al-Qaeda's largest formal affiliate in history. So Al-Qaeda has grown stronger in Syria. Mm-hmm. Why is this, and why have our U.S. policies not gone after Al-Qaeda in Syria?
Well, our policy is in Syria, which is a very complex battle space, Congresswoman, that where they're located right now, we do not want to go up into another part of Syria. We're doing this by, with, and through our partner forces. They do not have the capability to move into that region.
Time of the gentlelady's expired. Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, by way of background, I was one of some of our House Armed Services Committee members who, in 2011, voted against the Budget Control Act and its sequestration provisions that disproportionately cut national defense spending and so badly damaged America's national security. Now to the current date. Per the Congressional Budget Office, we face an $804 billion deficit this year, $12.5 trillion in total deficits over the next decade, and a total $33.8 trillion gross federal debt by 2028. Proverbs 22:7 warns us that, quote, the borrower is the slave of the lender, end quote. Similarly, I would submit, America's debt slowly but surely gives our creditors power over America. For emphasis, China, a geopolitical rival and perhaps a foe, is America's largest foreign creditor at $1.2 trillion. Here is our problem. If America's creditors simply stop loaning America more money, something they have every right to do, our federal government is immediately, the next day, insolvent and faces an immediate $800 billion shortfall. If this $800 billion shortfall is prorated equally across our $1.3 trillion discretionary budget, that translates into a devastating $400 billion cut to national defense immediately. In 2011, when America's gross federal debt was much less, at approximately $15 trillion, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen testified in this very same room that, quote, the most significant threat to our national security is our debt, end quote. Similarly, in 2017, when America's gross federal debt was roughly $20 trillion, you, Secretary Mattis, confirmed at your Senate hearing that, quote, the greatest threat to our national security is our own federal debt, end quote. In the time that remains, will you please help the American people understand why you believe America's out-of-control deficit and exploding debt are threats to America's national security?
Well, Congressman, I think any nation that can't keep its fiscal house in order eventually cannot maintain its military power, hence the connection to the Department of Defense that concerns me so much. It's also why we put solvency and security as watchwords at the Pentagon, because we need solvency first. So we're aligned with you. The situation I face is a worsening security situation in the world. So then, even with that thesis I just mentioned, I come in asking for an awful lot of money. The point I would make is in 1985, we spent 5.7% of our GDP on national defense. It was in the 36 percentile during World War II. But 1985 was not a war year for us, and we were spending 5.7. What we are asking for in 2019 is 3.1%. So we believe America can afford survival, and I recognize the competing and very tough decisions on domestic spending, on health care, on defense, and I can only tell you that we will spend every dollar as wisely as we can. I don't have stress, Congressman. I create it. If I find someone who's getting artful with the money you've given us, that person will have to leave our ranks as we try to buy the time, security-wise, for you to put the fiscal situation back under proper order.
General Dunford, do you share that concern about our accumulated deficits and total debt at some point becoming or currently being a national security threat?
I do, Congressman. It really gets to my opening statement that what I said was we needed sufficient resources to the Department of Defense. We also needed that to be sustainable and predictable. And clearly on the path we're on, the sustainability and the predictability is at risk.
On an entirely different subject matter, Secretary Mattis, do you believe that people who are illegally in the United States should be allowed to take military service opportunities from American citizens and lawful immigrants?
I'm not quite sure, sir. Very bluntly, we need every qualified patriot we can get our hands on, but we do not support illegal activity in our recruiting. So I know at times we've had an awful lot of legal immigrants, children of those families join at a much higher rate than we do with native-born, believe it or not. So we would like to see the immigration system fixed so that we have legal immigrants coming into the country, because we recruit very well from them. They're overrepresented, sir, in our ranks.
Thank you, Secretary Mattis, General Dunford, and Mr. Chairman.
Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, earlier you said in response to a colleague's question, you said we have not made any decision to launch attacks in Syria. Yesterday at 6:57 a.m., the President tweeted, Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming. Nice and new, and he put in quotes, smart, exclamation point. Can you resolve the disconnect between the answer that you gave and the commitment that the President made yesterday? I don't know if your microphone is on.
Today, our President did say that he's not made a decision. And I will tell you that we're meeting, when I leave here, I go to a meeting where the National Security Council will be meeting on this, and we will take forward the various options to the President.
When the President of the United States says these missiles will be coming, the President of the United States of America says these missiles will be coming, that sounds to me and to the rest of the world like a decision. In the answer to another question that was asked for the legal justification to fire missiles into Syria in response to these chemical weapons attacks. You said that we have troops in the field and we are not going to wait for them to be attacked before we take action. If we did not have U.S. service members in Syria, would you have the legal authorization to launch attacks in Syria in response to these chemical weapons attacks?
Yeah, Congressman, I'm going to have my lawyers start taking these questions. I look for the legitimate protection of the American people and their interests. I'm the Secretary of Defense, and I did not pick up a law degree on my way to the job, so I need to get some people to give me, I think, the specific answers to your question.
Thank you. We've talked today about North Korea, about Syria, about ISIS, about Russia, about China, but we have not talked about the threat that the country of Mexico poses to us. The President also announced recently that, these are his words, we are sending the United States military to secure our border with Mexico. Could you share with me what that will cost, what the mission is, how long it will last, since the President vowed to keep U.S. service members there until his wall is completed? And then I have a follow-up question for that.
I cannot tell you the cost yet, sir. I'm in close contact, daily contact with Secretary Nielsen. We're in support of Department of Homeland Security, Customs Border Enforcement personnel. And right now I've got about 800 deployed under the governor's authority. We are paying for them out of the Title 32 funds that the Congress has allocated. I believe I'll get a request for around 700 more in the second tranche. Those will mostly be helicopters and observation type forces. These forces will not involve themselves with the migrants themselves or have any law enforcement duties.
Related question, can any part of your budget be used to construct a wall, a fence, fortifications along the U.S.-Mexico border?
Probably the part where if I need to wall off or, put a fence along a bombing range, it's right next to the border. This is a safety consideration. I don't care who they are. They're human beings. I don't want them wandering into a bombing range that was active.
In 1997, then President Clinton sent the United States military to the border. A United States Marine shot and killed an 18-year-old U.S. citizen named Ezekiel Hernandez. The tragedy for the Hernandez family, the tragedy for that Marine who was put in a position for which he was not trained, should be something from which we learn. I think this is a grave mistake on the part of this country, and I would also, given everything else that we were talking about, all of our other challenges and threats and priorities around the world, I have to think that you also see, Mr. Secretary, the opportunity cost of sending the United States military to the U.S.-Mexico border at a time that it has never been more secure, more safe, where we have record low northbound apprehensions, the lowest numbers since 1971. The community, El Paso, Texas, that I represent, conjoined with Ciudad Juarez, forming the largest binational community in this hemisphere, is also one of the safest cities in the United States of America. I think this is a gross waste of taxpayer resources. I think this is a wasted opportunity in terms of what those service members could be doing. And I think it sets the stage for another tragedy if we do not carefully manage this. And I would urge you to advise the President to withdraw this commitment. We do not need another ill-defined, ill-planned mission for the United States military. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our panel today for their service and everything else. It's been a tough budget year. I was one of the ones that voted for the omnibus. I'm one of the ones that I cannot stand the Budget Control Act, and one of the big supporters behind the audit. I think that's extremely important so that we don't waste money and get the most cost efficiency. I want to switch gears a little bit. And Mr. Secretary, you talked about allies, and I want to talk about F-35s. Ever since I've been in Congress, it's been about the costs, the problems with the F-35s. And I think we've come a long ways correcting a lot of the problems that we had with it. I'm all on board and everything else, but it's not cheap. And now we're talking, well, Canada dropped out of the buy for that. And there's some of us on this committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee that are concerned about Turkey. and its behavior as an ally, and whether we should sell or continue to have Turkey as one of the recipients of the F-35. If for some reason they drop out of that program or we prevent them from buying that, is that going to significantly increase the costs of something which is extremely important to our future and obviously the conversation today, the budget that we're trying to do something about?
Congressman, we right now look at the F-35 as a program that we have got to drive down the costs on. And that is both the purchase cost, but it's also the flight hour cost, the sustainment cost, the cost of spare parts. So we have a full court press on this, working with the contractor in order to drive it down. We do have other allies around the world that are considering increasing the number of F-35s they buy. And right now I can't tell you that it's going to be equal, you know, if some drop and others are going to pick it up. But I will tell you that our focus on driving down costs and getting rid of excess costs is ongoing. We've had some success already since we got in, and between Ellen Lord and my deputy, Pat Shanahan, I've got two very capable people of going after this with the contractor and getting the best value on this aircraft. It is revolutionary. I realize how great it is, but it's got to be affordable.
General Dunford, were you going to comment on that at all, or?
No, the only thing I tell you, Congressman, we'd have to get back to the specific implications. Obviously, foreign military sales help hold down the cost, but I don't have the data on what the implications would be for Turkey, so we owe you an answer on that.
Okay, the last thing I just wanted to address, NATO. A number of us are on the NATO Parliament, and we're concerned about our allies. We have some very good allies in terms of meeting their commitment, and there's some that we're about half in and half out. Do you have any suggestions on how we can gently pressure our allies to meet their commitments on this?
And you used the right word, Congressman, commitments. Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, the NATO treaty, said every nation will provide enough for their own defense and the defense of fellow alliance members. Article 5, of course, where we stand together in the face of a threat against one, a threat against all, and the message that President Trump directed me to take to NATO a year ago when I first returned to that headquarters, having served there as a NATO Supreme Commander, was you cannot expect me to go in front of the Congress and say we need American parents to care more about the freedom of their children than they care about the freedom of their children. We have 15 nations that are on the right track to meet their Wales commitment, a pledge they made, and we want national plans, and thanks to Secretary General Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, former Prime Minister of Norway, he is pushing very hard that each nation come to the summit this year with the national plan showing how they're going to get at 2% of gross domestic product committed to defense. We do not have them all there, and when the pressure continues, and the President, in his usual blunt style, has made it very clear that this is where we're going.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Mattis, one of our concerns here obviously is Russia, and I'm following up on my fellow Marines' comments on NATO. One of the focuses that we've had is on the EDI, the European Defense Initiative. Last year's NDA, we asked for a report about what would be, actually we put a report in the NDA asking specifically what kind of resources, tooling, locations, in general, to give us more information so we can actually come up with a good EDI, this coming NDA. That has not arrived yet, and we're about to go back into the NDA again. So I'm just wondering, when is that report going to come out? You know, we want to be helpful. We want to make sure that we're giving you guys everything you need, but we need that type of information to actually properly size the budget for EDI. Secretary?
I regret that you don't have it yet. I need to go back and look at it, sir. There's over 1,700 reports I'm due every year to you all, and I confess that we at times have been late on a few. Chairman, do you have anything on EDI?
Congressman, I'm not sure about that specific report, although, I've looked at the details of the $6.5 billion that are in this year's submission. And broadly speaking, it addresses the infrastructure, and we can share with you the specific locations. It addresses the increased exercise program as a result of the rotational forces that have increased, and it's increasing the preposition equipment was the third piece. So those are the three pieces that make up the $6.5 billion, and I think we have a very clear sight picture exactly how that's allocated. We'll take back the requirement to report, which, like the Secretary, I'm not following a specific report, but I can assure you I'm following the specific way we plan to spend the European Defense Initiative, and we do have a detailed plan to lay out.
Well, thank you, General. For us, it'd be great that we could compare the two to make sure that we're right-sizing everything that's going on. And just to continue on that kind of vein of thought, and we could have two separate questions on this, but are you in favor of increasing our forces and adding more preposition equipment, or more specifically putting new basing locations in NATO with U.S. forces? General, you can start.
Yeah, did you say, Congressman, specifically in NATO?
In NATO territory, yes.
Yeah, we do not have plans at this time to increase. We have, with your help over the last 3 years, increased to the level that we believe is sustainable.
So, General, I understand that. Would you be in favor of that? Should we give you the right budget? Would you be in favor of putting more positioned U.S. military personnel in NATO territory?
To be honest with you, Congressman, right now, the Secretary has laid out the National Defense Strategy. We pretty much know what the forces that will be available over the next several years are, and we believe to meet our requirements for assurance and deterrence, we have the right U.S. composition in place right now, and realizing that that's going to be in the context of the other 28 members of NATO.
Okay. I mean, from some of the RAND studies that I've read and been involved with, what I've seen is that there is a clear picture that I've been told that we have a mass problem in the Eastern European theater, specifically when dealing with Russian armaments. Do we understand? Do you agree with some of these studies in terms of our mass problem and how we could fix that?
The math problem is accurate, sir. However, there's more to the power of NATO alliance than simply the number of American tanks, as you understand. Right. So what we're trying to do is make certain the American military is there in support of the NATO alliance, but at the same time, everyone's got to step up for this thing. And right now, I think we could always rotate more forces in during a period of heightened tensions, but overall, I think we've got it about right now, and we're working with the NATO partners to get their forces up on the step as well.
I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here today. Appreciate it. We have witnessed Russia tampering in our elections and that of our allies. And in open testimony, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of CIA, have talked about Russia undermining our defenses and our foreign policies. It's been reported that Russia is trying to undermine our energy investments in Europe. Our science committee has detailed how Russia has done this. In a declassified report from CIA in 1983, it detailed Russia's active measures concerning nuclear modernization, missile defense. And the report stated, and I quote, one report stated, their campaign covers a whole spectrum of activities from overt efforts to create a fear of nuclear war to covert measures including forgeries and disinformation. And so my question is, do you believe that Russia is carrying out these types of active measures today? What are we doing to counter them, and are the agencies involved able to coordinate well in those efforts?
I think that as you look at the National Defense Strategy, Congressman, and this is something that President Trump personally approved, I talked with him about it before I signed it, and you see Russia now registers as a strategic competitor. We didn't want that. We were all trying to make a partnership of sorts with Russia after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In the late 90s, early 2000s, I can remember Russian Marines training at Camp Lejeune with U.S. Marines for UN peacekeeping operations. That's in the dim past now, sir, as we watch what they've done from Georgia to Crimea, from the Ukraine to Syria. And so when you look at the gray zone issues that were brought up by a member earlier, this is where Russia is putting a lot of effort, the deniable, they think deniable efforts that they believe they can undermine our belief in democratic processes, elections, as you mentioned, undermine us financially. As you know, they have a declining economy, a worsening demographic, and until they wake up to the fact that they have a lot more to gain by working with Europe, by working with NATO, by being a responsible nation in the UN, we're going to have to deal with them in all areas as a strategic competitor.
So are you comfortable with how we may be countering their efforts?
We are doing better. I'll never be comfortable with our security. I'll always be looking for ways to improve.